The good news is that King John of England had absolutely everything a medieval monarch could dream of: castles, lands, armies, treasures, and unlimited power to do whatever he wanted. The bad news is that he managed to lose literally all of it through a spectacular combination of paranoia, incompetence, and greed that would make even the most corrupt modern politician blush with envy. We're talking about a guy who started his reign in 1199 with half of France under his control and ended it 17 years later having lost almost everything, including his dignity, his reputation, and apparently his common sense. This is the story of a man so spectacularly bad at being king that his own nobles forced him to sign a document limiting his power, which is basically like your employees making you sign a contract promising you'll stop being a terrible boss. Born on Christmas Eve in 1166, John was the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, which meant he was essentially the medieval equivalent of the kid who gets the hand-me-downs while his older brothers get the cool stuff. His father nicknamed him Lackland because, unlike his brothers who inherited territories and titles, John got absolutely nothing in the inheritance lottery, which is roughly as confidence-building as your parents naming you disappointment or the spare. Growing up as the baby of the family in a dynasty where succession meant everything must have been psychologically devastating, like being the youngest sibling who watches everyone else get cars for their 16th birthday while you get coupon book. Henry II apparently loved John the most, which makes the Lackland nickname even more brutal, like your favorite parent giving you a participation trophy while your siblings get actual trophies. Young John received an excellent education, which is ironic considering how stupidly he would later govern his kingdom, proving once again that intelligence and common sense are completely different things. He could read and write in Latin, spoke French fluently, and was interested in administration and law, which basically means he had all the tools to be a great king, but chose to use them like a toddler uses a hammer on expensive furniture. His education included studying under Ranulph de Glanville, one of the greatest legal minds of the time, which makes John's later tyranny even more inexcusable, like having Gordon Ramsay teach you to cook and then deciding to open a restaurant that only serves burnt toast. Despite his learning, John developed a reputation for cruelty, vindictiveness, and an almost pathological inability to trust anyone, which are exactly the qualities you don't want in someone who will eventually have the power of life and death over millions of people. John's personality was, to put it mildly, absolutely terrible, combining the worst traits of a dictator with the emotional maturity of a jealous teenager who just discovered their ex is dating someone hotter. He was known for his explosive temper, which could go from 0 to "I'm going to destroy your entire family" faster than you can say "Your Majesty," making every conversation with him feel like defusing a bomb while blindfolded. Contemporary chroniclers described him as suspicious, treacherous, and cruel, which in medieval terms basically means he was really bad, considering this was an era where stabbing your enemies was considered normal political discourse. John had a particular talent for making enemies out of allies, which is an impressive skill when your job literally depends on having people willing to fight and die for you. Like a CEO who manages to make every employee want to quit on their first day. His paranoia was legendary, reaching levels that would make even the most conspiracy-obsessed modern theorists seem reasonable by comparison, as he suspected everyone of plotting against him. And to be fair, eventually everyone was plotting against him, which is what happens when you treat people terribly. John employed a network of spies throughout his kingdom, spending enormous amounts of money to watch his own nobles, which is the medieval equivalent of a boss installing cameras in the bathroom because he thinks employees are stealing toilet paper. He trusted almost no one, changed his sleeping locations constantly, and allegedly tasted his food with such paranoia that mealtimes must have looked like a chemistry experiment conducted by someone who believes everyone is trying to poison them. This level of suspicion created a self-fulfilling prophecy. His paranoia made him cruel. His cruelty made people hate him, and their hatred justified his paranoia in a vicious circle that would eventually destroy his reign. John's relationship with his family was dysfunctional in ways that would require a team of therapists working overtime to unpack, starting with the fact that he joined his brothers in rebelling against their father, which is basically medieval treason disguised as family drama. When his older brother Richard became king and went off to the Crusades like a medieval action hero, John immediately tried to seize power, proving that brotherly love was not exactly his strong suit. More like brotherly backstabbing was his preferred family activity. Richard apparently forgave him when he returned, saying, "Think no more of it. You are only a child who has had evil counselors," which is simultaneously touching and insulting, like forgiving your adult sibling for stealing your car by saying they were probably just confused. John inherited the throne when Richard died in 1199 from a crossbow wound. And you have to wonder if part of him was relieved that he finally got what he'd been scheming for, like the understudy who's been secretly hoping the lead actor would trip on stage. As king, John's first major challenge was dealing with his nephew Arthur of Brittany, who had a legitimate claim to the throne and was supported by the French king Philip II, setting up a succession crisis that would define the early years of John's reign. The whole situation was complicated by medieval inheritance laws that were about as clear as mud mixed with more mud, where different regions followed different rules about whether the throne should go to the king's brother or his deceased older brother's son. John captured young Arthur in 1202 during a siege, and what happened next remains one of history's great mysteries. Though most historians agree it involved Arthur mysteriously disappearing and probably dying, which is medieval code for John almost certainly had him murdered. The official story is that Arthur just vanished, but everyone knew John was responsible, which damaged his reputation worse than a modern politician caught on camera doing literally anything they said they'd never do. The murder suspicions surrounding Arthur's death created a PR nightmare that John never recovered from, proving that even in medieval times, killing your teenage nephew was considered somewhat excessive, even by the low standards of royal succession disputes. Philip II of France used Arthur's disappearance as justification to confiscate John's French territories, which was basically medieval cancel culture, but with actual armies instead of Twitter mobs. John's response to losing his French lands was spectacularly incompetent, combining poor military strategy with a complete inability to keep his nobles motivated, like a general who keeps losing battles and then wonders why his soldiers aren't enthusiastic about following him into more defeats. By 1204, he had lost Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Tyrant, basically most of the Angevin Empire that his father and brother had spent decades building, which is the historical equivalent of inheriting a successful family business and running it into the ground within 5 years. John's obsession with recovering his lost French territories consumed the rest of his reign, leading him to demand more and more money from his subjects to fund military campaigns that consistently failed, like a gambler who keeps doubling down on losing bets. He imposed crushing taxes on his barons, demanded exorbitant fees for inheritance, and sold royal offices to the highest bidder, essentially running England like a medieval extortion racket where the king was the mob boss and everyone else was forced to pay protection money. His financial demands became so outrageous that he literally taxed everything he could think of, including charging fees for nobles to marry, fees to not go to war, and fees for the privilege of staying on your own land, which is like your landlord charging you rent plus extra fees for breathing air in the apartment. The money flowed into John's treasury faster than water down a drain, but it all went toward funding failed military campaigns and John's increasingly lavish lifestyle, proving that he had learned absolutely nothing from losing his French territories except how to lose money even faster. His treatment of the nobility was particularly stupid considering he needed their support to govern the kingdom. Yet he seemed determined to alienate them through a combination of arbitrary punishments, excessive taxation, and general dickishness that would be impressive if it weren't so self-destructive. John used his royal prerogative to seize estates, demand hostages from noble families as insurance against rebellion, and generally treat his barons like ATM machines that occasionally complained, which is not a sustainable governance strategy unless your goal is to make everyone hate you. He showed particular vindictiveness toward anyone he suspected of disloyalty, real or imagined, ruining families on the basis of rumors and paranoid suspicions, like a boss who fires employees because he had a dream they were stealing from him. The barons tolerated this treatment for years, paying John's exorbitant fees and swallowing their pride. But everyone has a breaking point, and John seemed determined to find exactly where that point was located by stomping on it repeatedly while laughing maniacally. John's conflict with the Catholic Church was another masterclass in bad decision-making, because picking a fight with the most powerful institution in medieval Europe is roughly as smart as declaring war on gravity. The trouble started in 1205 when the Archbishop of Canterbury died, and John wanted to appoint his own candidate while Pope Innocent III had other ideas, leading to a standoff that would last for years and accomplish absolutely nothing except making everyone miserable. When the Pope appointed Stephen Langton as Archbishop without John's approval, the king responded by refusing to let Langton enter England and seizing church property, which is the medieval equivalent of getting into an argument with your boss and deciding to burn down the office to prove your point. Pope Innocent III responded by placing England under interdict in 1208, which meant no church services, no marriages, no baptisms, and no burials in consecrated ground. Basically, the medieval version of a general strike by the clergy that made everyone's life worse to pressure John into backing down. John's response to the interdict was typically John. He seized even more church property and essentially told the Pope to go ahead and do his worst, showing all the political wisdom of someone poking an angry bear with a stick while standing in honey. For 5 years, England remained under interdict while John lived it up on confiscated church revenues, probably thinking he was clever for turning a religious crisis into a profit opportunity, like someone who sees a natural disaster and immediately starts thinking about how to monetize it. In 1209, the Pope escalated by excommunicating John personally, which in medieval terms meant the king was officially going to hell and nobody was obligated to obey him anymore, roughly equivalent to having your professional license revoked and your face posted on a do not hire billboard. Even this didn't immediately break John, who apparently believed he could outlast the Pope through sheer stubbornness, proving once again that confidence and competence are completely unrelated qualities. Eventually, after England was threatened with a full-scale invasion blessed by the Pope, John finally caved in 1213, accepting Langton as Archbishop and agreeing to make England a papal fief, which means he went from fighting for independence from the church to literally making England the Pope's property, possibly the worst negotiation outcome in medieval history. His surrender to the Pope was so complete and humiliating that it makes modern political flip-flops look dignified by comparison, as John didn't just accept defeat, but literally handed over his entire kingdom to become the Pope's vassal, like losing an argument so badly you agree to become your opponent's employee. He promised to pay an annual tribute of 1,000 marks to Rome, essentially turning England into a subscription service for the papacy, where the king paid monthly fees for the privilege of keeping his crown, which is the medieval equivalent of paying your landlord rent for a house you technically own. The whole debacle cost John whatever credibility he had left with his barons, who watched their king go from defying the Pope to groveling before him, demonstrating a level of strategic incompetence that would be studied for centuries as an example of exactly what not to do in international relations. John probably thought he was being clever by making the Pope his overlord, believing it would protect him from his enemies. But all he really accomplished was adding another layer of humiliation to his already impressive collection of failures. Meanwhile, his military campaigns to recover his French territories continued to fail with remarkable consistency, like a sports team that loses every single game, but somehow convinces itself that next season will be different. In 1214, John assembled a massive coalition to attack France from 2 directions, spending virtually all of England's wealth on what was supposed to be the campaign that would restore the Angevin Empire and make him look like a proper warrior king instead of the disaster everyone knew him to be. His plan was actually pretty good on paper. He would attack from the west while his allies, including the Holy Roman Emperor, would attack from the northeast, catching King Philip II of France in a classic pincer movement that any military strategist would appreciate. The only problem was that John's execution was about as effective as trying to open a can with a rubber hammer, because while his allies got destroyed at the Battle of Bouvines, John himself accomplished absolutely nothing on his front, basically proving that he couldn't even succeed when someone else did the hard work for him. The defeat at Bouvines in July 1214 was catastrophic, not just militarily, but financially and politically, as it destroyed any hope of recovering the French territories and demonstrated to everyone that John had wasted years of tax revenue on achieving nothing except bankruptcy and embarrassment. The barons who had paid crushing taxes to fund this disaster were understandably furious, having essentially thrown their money into a fire and watched it burn while John stood there, insisting it was all part of his master plan. John returned to England that autumn to face subjects who were broke, angry, and completely done with his incompetence. Like a CEO returning from a failed business venture to find the company in ruins and the board of directors sharpening their knives. The northern barons, who had been particularly opposed to funding John's French adventures, began openly discussing rebellion, which is what happens when you tax people to poverty to fund your personal grudges, and then fail spectacularly to accomplish anything except proving your own inadequacy. By early 1215, rebellion was spreading faster than gossip at a medieval court, with barons across England refusing to pay taxes, gathering armies, and generally behaving like people who had decided their king was more trouble than he was worth. The rebels captured London in May, which was basically game over for John, since controlling the capital meant controlling the kingdom's economic heart, like protesters occupying City Hall and refusing to leave until the mayor resigns. John, faced with the choice between fighting a civil war he would probably lose or negotiating with people who hated him, chose negotiation, which was possibly the first smart decision he'd made in his entire reign, though smart might be too generous a term for acknowledging obvious reality. The meeting between the king and the rebel barons took place at Runnymede, a meadow by the Thames, in June 1215, which sounds peaceful and diplomatic until you remember that John was essentially being held hostage by his own subjects, like a kidnapping where the victim has to pretend it's a business meeting. The document they produced was Magna Carta, which sounds grand and important until you realize it was basically a list of complaints about John's behavior dressed up as legal principles, like an HR report documenting every terrible thing your boss has done before firing him. The charter contained 63 clauses limiting royal power, protecting baronial rights, and establishing that even the king had to follow the law, which was revolutionary for medieval England, but also a massive personal humiliation for John, who had to publicly admit he'd been governing so badly that people had to force him to promise to behave like a reasonable human being. Some of the clauses were specific responses to John's abuses. No more arbitrary imprisonment. No more excessive fines. No more selling justice to the highest bidder. Essentially a legal document saying stop being such a terrible person in medieval Latin. John signed it on June 15th, 1215, probably while internally screaming about the injustice of being forced to stop committing injustices, and the barons made multiple copies to be distributed throughout the kingdom so everyone would know that the king's power had limits now. Of course, John had absolutely no intention of actually following Magna Carta, because honoring agreements wasn't exactly his strong suit. More like breaking promises was his signature move throughout his entire reign. Within weeks of signing, he was already writing to the Pope asking him to annul the charter, which is the medieval equivalent of signing a contract and immediately calling your lawyer to find loopholes, except John wasn't even subtle about it. Pope Innocent III, now John's feudal overlord thanks to that humiliating surrender 2 years earlier, was happy to declare Magna Carta null and void, calling it an agreement made under duress that violated the king's dignity, which is technically true, but also completely misses the point that John's dignity had violated itself years ago. The barons, unsurprisingly, were not amused by John's immediate betrayal, having correctly predicted that he would break his promises faster than you can say constitutional crisis, leading England into a full-scale civil war that would consume the final year of John's life. The First Barons' War, as it's called, was essentially John versus most of his kingdom, which is never a good position for a monarch to find himself in, like a CEO fighting a hostile takeover by his entire company, including the janitors. The rebel barons, realizing that John would never honor Magna Carta, and that they'd never be safe while he was king, made the logical decision to invite Prince Louis of France to invade England and become their new king, which is the ultimate vote of no confidence in your current leadership. Think about how badly you have to screw up as King of England for English nobles to decide they'd rather have a French prince ruling them. Like doing such a terrible job that your employees publicly announce they prefer to work for your main competitor. Louis landed in England in May 1216 with an army, and substantial portions of the country welcomed him, which must have been psychologically devastating for John, watching his subjects celebrate the arrival of a foreign invader because literally anyone was better than him. John spent the last months of his life running around England, trying to fight the rebels and the French invasion, probably wondering how everything had gone so catastrophically wrong. Though if he'd engaged in even a moment of self-reflection, he would have realized he'd been working toward this disaster for 17 years. He actually showed some military competence during this period, which makes his earlier failures even more frustrating, like discovering someone can do their job properly, but just chose not to for years. In October 1216, while traveling through East Anglia, John lost part of his treasure and baggage train in the Wash, an estuary with treacherous tidal waters, which is such a perfect metaphor for his reign that it barely needs explanation. The greedy king who spent his life accumulating wealth literally lost it all in the mud. Some historians think he also contracted dysentery around this time, possibly from eating too many peaches and drinking too much cider, which means one of England's most hated kings potentially died because he couldn't control himself at dinner, like choking at a buffet after spending your life hoarding food. John died on the night of October 18th to 1216 at Newark Castle at the age of 49, leaving behind a kingdom in civil war, a French army occupying half the country, and a legacy so toxic that his 9-year-old son Henry III inherited not just a crown, but a complete disaster zone. His death was probably a relief to everyone, including possibly John himself, who spent his final days watching his life's work crumble into dust and ashes like a sandcastle destroyed by the tide. He was buried at Worcester Cathedral, having requested to be interred there, and his tomb effigy shows him looking peaceful and regal, which is hilariously ironic considering he spent his actual life in a constant state of paranoid rage, like a before and after picture where the after is a lie. The Civil War ended within a year of his death, with the French invasion collapsing and the barons rallying around young Henry III, proving that the main problem with England had been John all along, like a company that immediately improves the moment the terrible CEO leaves. His reputation never recovered, and probably never will, because historians have been roasting John for 8 centuries with a consistency that suggests he genuinely earned every bit of criticism. Medieval chroniclers called him cruel, treacherous, and tyrannical, using language so harsh you'd think they were describing a supervillain rather than an actual king who ruled for 17 years. Shakespeare portrayed him in King John as a complex but ultimately pathetic figure, which is actually generous compared to most historical assessments that essentially describe him as what happens when you give unlimited power to someone with the emotional regulation of a toddler and the moral compass of a broken GPS. Later historians have occasionally tried to rehabilitate his reputation, arguing that he faced impossible circumstances and that his brothers weren't exactly saints either, which is true, but also kind of like defending someone's terrible driving by pointing out the road was bumpy, ignoring the fact that they were also drunk, speeding, and steering with their eyes closed. The Magna Carta that John was forced to sign became one of the most important documents in Western legal history, which means John's greatest contribution to civilization was being such a terrible king that people invented constitutional monarchy to protect themselves from him. The charter was reissued multiple times after John's death, becoming embedded in English law and eventually influencing legal systems worldwide, including the U.S. Constitution, which means John's legacy is literally he was so bad at being king that he accidentally helped create modern democracy by making people realize monarchs needed rules too. It's the historical equivalent of being remembered as the reason warning labels exist, like the person who made everyone realize you need to explicitly tell people not to use hairdryers in the bathtub. The specific clauses about John's abuses were eventually dropped from later versions of Magna Carta, but the principle that even kings must follow the law survived and flourished, becoming the foundation for centuries of constitutional development, which is a pretty significant achievement for a document that started as essentially a list of complaints about one particularly terrible monarch. Modern historians debate whether John was genuinely evil or simply catastrophically incompetent, which is a bit like arguing whether someone crashed their car on purpose or because they were terrible at driving, while ignoring that either way, the car is totaled and people are injured. Some scholars point out that medieval kingship required brutality and that John's real crime was being ineffective rather than cruel, as if being a failure somehow excuses being a tyrant. Like saying your terrible boss isn't really that bad because at least he's also incompetent at running the company. The revisionist view argues that John faced impossible challenges, including fighting a war on multiple fronts, dealing with an overmighty papacy, and inheriting a bankrupt treasury from Richard's crusading adventures. Which is all true, except it ignores that John made literally every situation worse through his own paranoia and greed, even giving John every possible benefit of the doubt. The best you can say is that he took a difficult situation and transformed it into an absolute catastrophe through a combination of poor judgment, worse timing, and an apparent inability to learn from any of his countless mistakes, like someone who keeps touching hot stoves and blaming the stove for being hot. John's financial management deserves special attention because it demonstrates how you can technically be good at math while being absolutely terrible at economics, like someone who can calculate compound interest but uses that skill exclusively to figure out how much money they can extract from people before they revolt. He was actually quite innovative in his revenue collection, introducing new taxes and fees with the creativity of a modern tech company finding new ways to charge subscription fees. Except instead of streaming services, it was your right to exist without being imprisoned or having your land confiscated. His administration kept meticulous records, and historians have used these documents to reconstruct his finances in detail, revealing that John was spending money as fast as he could collect it, like someone making six figures who somehow ends up broke every month because they can't stop buying things they don't need. The pipe rolls, which recorded royal income and expenditure, show John squeezing England for every penny while simultaneously wasting those pennies on failed military campaigns, lavish gifts to temporary allies, and personal luxuries, proving that being organized doesn't mean being smart about money. His treatment of Jewish communities in England was particularly horrific, combining medieval anti-Semitism with his personal greed in ways that were terrible even by the low standards of the 13th century, which is saying something because medieval Europe was not exactly known for religious tolerance. John heavily taxed Jewish moneylenders, who were already restricted to certain professions by discriminatory laws, demanding impossible sums and imprisoning or torturing those who couldn't pay, like a protection racket that didn't even pretend to offer protection. In 1210, he imposed a crushing tallage on the Jewish community, allegedly torturing those who couldn't pay by pulling out teeth one by one until they agreed to hand over their wealth, which is so cartoonishly evil it sounds made up, except multiple sources confirm John really was that monstrous. He treated Jewish communities as personal ATMs, extracting wealth through force and terror, and when he drained them of money, he offered basically no protection from violence, demonstrating that his cruelty and greed weren't limited to his Christian subjects, but extended to anyone he had power over, regardless of their religion or status. John's personal life was equally messy, featuring the kind of scandals that would dominate tabloids today if tabloids existed in medieval England, which they didn't, but chroniclers filled that role by writing down all the juicy gossip about the king's behavior. He married twice, first to Isabella of Gloucester when he was still a prince, then annulled that marriage when he became king, which sounds romantic until you realize he dumped his first wife because she didn't bring enough political advantages, like someone divorcing their spouse because they didn't get enough Instagram followers from the wedding photos. His second marriage to Isabella of Angoulême in 1200 caused a major political crisis because she was already engaged to Hugh IX of Lusignan, and John basically stole her away, which was romantic in the way that stealing someone's car is technically impressive, but also definitely illegal and wrong. This love triangle, or rather King abducts his vassal's fiancée situation, gave King Philip II of France the perfect excuse to declare John an unfaithful vassal and confiscate his French territories, proving once again that John couldn't resist making terrible decisions even when the consequences were obvious to everyone except him. Isabella of Angoulême was only about 12 years old when John married her, which was not unusual for medieval royal marriages, but is still deeply disturbing by any modern standard, like discovering your favorite historical figure did something that would get them arrested today. She was reportedly very beautiful, which is how chroniclers explain John's impulsive decision to marry her despite the political complications, as if being attracted to someone justifies starting a war and losing half your empire, like burning down your house because you saw a cute puppy inside and wanted to pet it immediately. Their marriage produced 5 children, including the future Henry III, but was apparently not particularly happy, possibly because it started with international incident and continued through years of wars, rebellions, and John's increasingly paranoid behavior. Isabella survived John by nearly 3 decades and eventually returned to France, where she married Hugh X of Lusignan, the son of the man John had originally stolen her from, which is either poetic justice or just extremely awkward family dynamics, like dating your ex's son, to really make a point about moving on. John's relationship with women in general was reportedly problematic, which is medieval chronicler code, for he was definitely a sexual predator, as multiple sources accuse him of seducing or forcing himself on the wives and daughters of his nobles, which is both morally reprehensible and politically stupid. These allegations, whether entirely true or partially exaggerated by hostile writers, damaged his reputation severely among the baronage, because apparently medieval nobles could tolerate a king who was greedy and cruel but drew the line at one who sexually assaulted their female relatives, which is a pretty low bar that John somehow managed to limbo under. One chronicler claimed that John's treatment of noble women was a major factor in the Barons' rebellion, suggesting that his inability to keep his hands to himself literally cost him his kingdom, like a CEO getting fired because he couldn't stop harassing employees despite multiple warnings. Whether these stories are completely accurate or partly propaganda, they reveal that John's contemporaries believed he was capable of such behavior, which tells you something about his character, that even allowing for medieval bias and exaggeration, people found these accusations entirely plausible based on everything else they knew about him. His daily routine as king involved far more administrative work than most people imagine medieval monarchs doing, because despite being terrible at actually ruling, John was obsessively involved in the details of government in ways that were both impressive and counterproductive. He traveled constantly throughout England, never staying in one place long, partly for security reasons due to his paranoia, and partly because medieval kings literally consumed their way through regions, eating all the local food supplies before moving on like a royal locust swarm. His household records show he was present at legal proceedings, personally intervened in cases, and kept close tabs on his sheriffs and officials, demonstrating a level of micromanagement that would make modern middle managers look hands-off by comparison. Except John used his attention to detail primarily for finding new ways to extract money rather than improving governance. He was apparently a night owl who often worked late into the evening reviewing documents and accounts, which means even his sleep schedule was designed to make everyone around him miserable, like a boss who sends emails at 2 a.m. and expects immediate responses. John's court was itinerant, meaning it moved constantly, which sounds romantic like a medieval road trip, until you realize it meant packing up an entire government administration every few days and hauling it across muddy roads to the next castle. The logistics were nightmare-inducing. Hundreds of people, thousands of documents, furniture, clothes, weapons, food supplies, and the entire machinery of government all had to be loaded onto carts and transported regularly. Like moving house every week, except the house is also your office, and you can't just hire movers because professional moving companies won't exist for about 8 centuries. This constant movement served multiple purposes. It allowed John to personally oversee different regions, made him harder to assassinate because nobody knew exactly where he'd be, and prevented any local food supplies from being completely exhausted, though it also meant he could spread his terrible reputation more efficiently by personally annoying people throughout his entire kingdom. The servants and officials who had to manage this traveling circus probably had the most legitimate grievance against John, having to constantly pack and unpack while the king complained about everything and trusted no one. Like working for a boss who insists on moving the office to a new building every Monday. His diet was lavish even by royal standards, featuring the kind of excess that would make modern nutritionists weep while medieval peasants starved, because apparently John believed that being king meant eating like every meal might be your last, even though he had literally unlimited access to food. Records show he consumed massive quantities of meat, fish, wine, and exotic spices, spending enormous sums on imported delicacies while his subjects struggled to afford bread. Like a billionaire Instagram influencer posting pictures of gold-covered steaks while their employees work multiple jobs to pay rent. He apparently loved lampreys, which are horrifying eel-like parasitic fish that look like something from a nightmare, but were considered a delicacy, proving that medieval cuisine involved eating things that modern people would run away from screaming. His excessive eating and drinking probably contributed to his final illness, with some sources suggesting he literally ate and drank himself to death, which would be a fitting end for a king whose entire reign was defined by consuming more than he could sustain, metaphorically devouring his kingdom until there was nothing left but debt and rebellion. John's legacy includes a surprising number of administrative innovations that survived long after he died, which is ironic considering his personal governance was catastrophically bad, like someone who invents an amazing tool and then uses it exclusively to hit themselves in the face. He expanded the royal chancery, improved record-keeping, and developed more sophisticated methods of financial administration, essentially modernizing English government, even while using that modern government primarily for oppression and extraction. His reign saw the development of more regular taxation systems, which sounds boring until you realize it meant the government could more efficiently take money from people, like upgrading from robbing people with a knife to robbing them with a sophisticated computer system that tracks exactly how much they have so you can take it all. These administrative developments were actually quite impressive from a technical standpoint, demonstrating that John was intelligent and capable of innovation, which makes his failures even more frustrating because he clearly had the ability to be a decent king, but chose instead to be history's example of how not to rule a kingdom. His reputation in popular culture has been shaped largely by the Robin Hood legends, where John appears as the villain oppressing Nottingham while the heroic outlaw steals from the rich to give to the poor, which is historically inaccurate but spiritually true to John's actual reign. The earliest Robin Hood stories don't actually mention John, but later versions incorporated him as the evil king whose greed and tyranny justified rebellion and resistance, essentially using John as a symbol of bad government that needed to be opposed, like how modern stories use fictional corrupt politicians as villains because everyone understands that archetype immediately. Prince John in Disney's 1973 Robin Hood is a thumb-sucking coward who sucks his thumb while screaming "Mother," which is both hilarious and more dignity than the real John probably deserves, considering at least cartoon John is funny, while real John was just depressing. The popular image of John as a sniveling, greedy tyrant who ruled badly, while his heroic brother Richard was away, actually contains a kernel of truth, though the real Richard was also pretty terrible as a king, just terrible and different, more photogenic ways involving swords and crusades rather than paranoid administrative oppression. The comparison between John and Richard is fascinating because it shows how much medieval reputation depended on appearing heroic even if you were actually incompetent at the boring work of government. Like how people forgive their favorite celebrities for doing questionable things because they're charismatic and attractive. Richard spent almost all his reign outside England, bankrupted the kingdom paying for crusades and ransoms, spoke barely any English, and basically treated England as a cash machine to fund his military adventures. Yet he's remembered as Richard the Lionheart and appears in stories as a noble hero. John actually stayed in England, tried to govern personally, and showed up to do the work, yet he's remembered as one of history's worst kings, proving that perception matters more than reality and that it's better to be an incompetent hero than a competent villain, or in John's case, an incompetent villain who at least showed up to work. The real lesson is that both brothers were pretty terrible kings in different ways, but Richard had the good sense to die young in a dramatic battle, while John lived long enough to fail repeatedly in boring, bureaucratic ways that made everyone hate him personally. John's military career deserves its own special category of failure, representing a masterclass in how to lose battles, territories, and your soldiers' respect through a combination of cowardice, poor planning, and terrible timing that would be impressive if it weren't so pathetic. Unlike his brother Richard, who genuinely enjoyed fighting and was quite good at it despite being reckless, John seemed to approach warfare like someone who studied all the theory but panicked the moment actual swords appeared, like a driving instructor who's read every manual but freezes behind the wheel during the actual test. His nickname Soft Sword apparently arose from his military incompetence, which is the medieval equivalent of being called the guy who brings a pool noodle to a knife fight, and roughly as devastating to one's reputation as a warrior king. The nickname stuck because John's military record was so consistently terrible that people needed a shorthand way to reference his failures without listing every single defeat, which would take hours and probably require multiple volumes. His loss of Normandy in 1204 was particularly humiliating because he basically gave up without fighting, choosing to negotiate and retreat rather than defend the duchy that his ancestors had held for over a century, like a security guard abandoning a bank vault the moment robbers show up, because fighting seems hard. When Philip II of France besieged Chateau Gallard, the massive fortress Richard had built to protect Normandy, John was supposed to relieve the siege with his army, but instead dithered, delayed, and eventually did nothing while the garrison starved and surrendered after months of desperate resistance. The defenders of Chateau Gallard held out from September 1203 to March 1204, probably expecting their king to rescue them at any moment, slowly realizing that John had abandoned them like a friend who promises to help you move, but mysteriously becomes unavailable when moving day arrives. After Chateau Gallard fell, the rest of Normandy collapsed like dominoes because nobody believed John would actually defend them, which is what happens when you establish a reputation for abandoning people who depend on you, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where your cowardice makes defense impossible. John's excuse for not relieving Chateau Gallard was that he didn't have enough forces, which might have been believable except he seemed to have plenty of forces for things he actually wanted to do, like oppressing his own subjects and seizing church property, suggesting his real problem was selective competence. He apparently spent the siege period in comfortable quarters, possibly drinking and entertaining himself while his soldiers starve in the fortress, which is leadership roughly equivalent to a ship captain abandoning crew members during a storm because the lifeboat looks more comfortable than a bridge. Contemporary chroniclers noted his failure to relieve the siege with disgust, using language that basically translates to "the king was too lazy and cowardly to save his own territory," which is not the kind of medieval performance review that leads to promotions or respect. The fall of Chateau Gallard became symbolic of John's entire military career. Lots of expensive preparation, strategic fortifications that should have been impregnable, and then complete failure at the moment when actual courage and leadership were required, like building an expensive security system and then leaving the front door wide open. His naval operations were slightly more successful, which isn't saying much considering his land campaigns set the bar somewhere around ankle height. But John did understand that controlling the English Channel was strategically important, even if he couldn't quite figure out what to do with that understanding. He invested in building a royal navy, recognizing that England's island position made naval power crucial for both defense and offensive operations, showing strategic thinking that unfortunately never translated into actual victories, because thinking about strategy and executing strategy are completely different skills. John's fleet won a significant victory at Dam in 1213, destroying many French ships and preventing a planned invasion, which was genuinely impressive, except John wasn't actually present for the battle, proving that he was more effective as a king when he stayed away and let competent people do the fighting. This pattern repeated throughout his reign. Whenever John personally commanded forces, the results were disasters. But when he delegated to capable subordinates, things occasionally worked, suggesting that his best military contribution would have been staying in a castle somewhere eating lampreys while other people did the actual war. The Bouvines campaign of 1214 was John's master plan to recover everything he'd lost, involving careful diplomatic preparation, massive financial investment, and coordination with powerful allies, including the Holy Roman Emperor, which on paper should have worked except it required John to actually execute his part of the plan competently. His strategy was sound. Attack France from two directions simultaneously, forcing Philip II to divide his forces and creating opportunities for decisive victories that would restore the Angevin Empire and make everyone forget about John's previous failures, like a gambler betting everything on one final hand that's definitely going to win this time. John assembled a large army, transported it to France, and then proceeded to accomplish absolutely nothing while his allies got destroyed at Bouvines on July 27, 1214, which remains one of the most significant battles in medieval history, except John wasn't there, and his absence pretty well summarizes his entire military career. His part of the campaign involved raiding around Anjou, achieving tactical victories that meant nothing strategically, like winning arguments about minor points while losing the entire debate. And when news arrived that his allies had been crushed at Bouvines, John's reaction was apparently to just give up and go home, like a student who hears the test is hard and decides to drop the class instead of studying. The disaster of Bouvines cost John everything: his treasure, his credibility, his last hope of recovering the French territories, and ultimately his throne, proving that sometimes one really bad day can ruin your entire career, especially if that career was already hanging by a thread of failures and broken promises. He'd spent years collecting crushing taxes from his subjects specifically to fund this campaign, promising that this time would be different. This time he'd win and restore England's glory. And then he failed so completely that even trying to spin it as a learning experience would be impossible. The English barons who'd paid for this disaster were understandably furious, having essentially funded John's expensive military tourism to France, where he accomplished nothing except proving once again that he was terrible at his job, like crowdfunding a friend's business venture and watching them spend all the money on a vacation instead. John returned to England in October 1214 to face subjects who were broke, angry, and completely done with believing his promises, which is what happens when you repeatedly ask people to trust you and then repeatedly demonstrate that trusting you is a mistake. His approach to siege warfare showed similar incompetence, managing to be simultaneously too aggressive and too cautious, depending on circumstances, like someone who can't find the correct setting on any dial because they only know how to turn it to maximum or minimum. When besieging Rochester Castle in 1215 during the Civil War, John actually showed determination, spending months reducing the fortress even as winter approached, using mining operations to collapse a tower, and eventually forcing the garrison to surrender. He reportedly ordered 40 fat pigs to be used in the mining operation because their fat was perfect for starting fires hot enough to crack the stone, which is both clever and disgusting, like solving a problem with a solution that technically works but makes everyone uncomfortable about your thought process. However, this rare display of military persistence came during a civil war against his own subjects, meaning John's most impressive military achievement was successfully besieging his own castle filled with his own barons, which is like a CEO's greatest accomplishment being winning a lawsuit against his own employees for trying to stop him from running the company into the ground. John's treatment of prisoners and hostages reveals the cruelty that made even medieval chroniclers uncomfortable, which is saying something because medieval warfare wasn't exactly known for its humanitarian concerns or Geneva Conventions about proper prisoner treatment. After capturing Rochester Castle, he wanted to hang all the defenders and only reluctantly agreed to spare them when his advisors pointed out that if he started executing noble prisoners, his own men would face the same treatment when captured, which is the kind of basic strategic thinking John apparently needed explained to him like a child learning not to hit people because they might hit back. He held numerous hostages from noble families as insurance against rebellion, keeping children and wives in his custody under threat of death or mutilation if their families misbehaved, which is both morally reprehensible and strategically stupid because it guaranteed that those families would hate him forever. Some sources claim he starved hostages to death, including Matilda de Braos and her son William, who allegedly died in captivity at Windsor Castle, though the details are disputed. Regardless of the exact truth, The fact that people believed John capable of such atrocities tells you everything about his reputation for cruelty. His paranoia about betrayal led him to demand hostages from even his most loyal supporters, which is an excellent way to turn loyal supporters into secret enemies who are just waiting for an opportunity to rebel, like a boss who asks employees to put up their personal belongings as collateral for keeping their jobs. John seemed to operate on the principle that fear was more effective than loyalty, which might work in the short term, but creates exactly the kind of resentment that eventually explodes in a full-scale rebellion, as evidenced by the fact that his entire kingdom rose against him. He rotated hostages regularly, moving them between castles to prevent rescue attempts and to keep families off balance, running a system of terror that was both elaborate and counterproductive since all that effort went into controlling people who might have supported him if he'd just been less of a terrible human being. The hostage system probably cost more to maintain than it prevented in rebellions, like an expensive security system that actually makes your house less safe because the security guards end up robbing you themselves. His final campaign during the Civil War showed occasional flashes of competence mixed with his usual strategic confusion, like a broken clock that's right twice a day, except John's clock was broken in ways that made it unpredictably wrong most of the time. He moved quickly, struck at rebel positions, and showed energy in prosecuting the war against his own barons and the French invaders, which would be admirable if the entire situation weren't his own fault in the first place. Like praising someone for energetically cleaning up a mess they created themselves. John recaptured some castles and had minor successes, but nothing that could actually turn the tide of the war, especially since Prince Louis controlled London and much of the southeast, meaning John was essentially fighting to reconquer his own kingdom from people who'd invited a French prince to replace him. The march through East Anglia that led to losing his baggage train in the Wash was typical John. Moving fast, maybe accomplishing something tactically, but ultimately making a costly mistake that wiped out any gains, like running a marathon only to trip at the finish line and break your leg while your competitor walks past you to victory. His death during active campaign season meant he never had to face the likely outcome of the Civil War, which probably would have been either capture, forced abdication, or assassination, none of which are great endings even by medieval standards where kings dying violently was relatively common. Some historians speculate that if John had lived longer, the Civil War might have been even more destructive, potentially fragmenting England between multiple factions and changing the course of British history, like an alternate timeline where one person's death or survival completely changes everything that follows. Others argue that John's death was perfectly timed to save England, as his departure allowed the regency government for young Henry III to make peace with the rebels and expel the French, essentially solving all of England's problems by removing the problem king from the equation. Either way, John's military legacy is consistently terrible. He lost territories, lost battles, lost his soldiers' respect, and ultimately lost his kingdom to a combination of his own incompetence and the justified rebellion of subjects who'd had enough of his disastrous leadership, proving that in medieval politics like modern politics, being consistently bad at your job eventually catches up with you. His strategic vision was oddly disconnected from his tactical execution, like someone who can describe exactly how to win a game, but then makes all the wrong moves when actually playing, understanding theory, while failing completely at practice. John apparently understood that recovering the French territories required money, allies, and military force, and he successfully gathered 2 out of 3, but then failed at the actual military force part, because understanding what needs to be done and being able to do it are completely different things. He spent years preparing for campaigns that lasted months and achieved nothing, like studying for a test for weeks and then freezing during the actual exam and writing your name wrong. His reign demonstrated that intelligence and competence aren't the same thing, that understanding problems doesn't mean you can solve them, and that sometimes the biggest obstacle to success is yourself, which are lessons that remain relevant 8 centuries later, even if the specific context of medieval warfare and feudal politics has changed. John's relationship with money was essentially that of an addict with their substance of choice, except instead of drugs or alcohol, it was other people's wealth, and his addiction literally destroyed his kingdom while creating constitutional protections that would outlast him by centuries. He approached taxation with the creativity of a modern app developer, finding ways to monetize every possible user interaction. Except instead of annoying pop-up ads, it was armed men showing up at your castle demanding payment for things like relief, which was basically a fee for inheriting your own family's land, as if the government charged you thousands of dollars to receive property your parents left you. His innovation in financial extraction was genuinely impressive from a technical standpoint, like admiring a bank robber's planning while acknowledging they're still robbing banks. As John found ways to tax things nobody had thought to tax before, turning royal government into a profit center that existed primarily to enrich the king rather than serve the kingdom. The Exchequer records show he collected more revenue than any previous English king, which sounds like an achievement until you realize he also spent more than any previous king while accomplishing less, like someone bragging about their income while hiding their credit card debt. His system of fines was particularly insidious because the word sounds like punishment for wrongdoing, but actually meant payments for privileges, essentially charging people for basic rights that should have been free, like a subscription service for being allowed to exist peacefully. Want to marry? That'll cost you a fine to the king for permission, with amounts varying based on how much John thought he could squeeze from you, like surge pricing, but for fundamental life events. Want to inherit your father's lands? Another fine, calculated as a percentage of the estate's value, meaning the wealthier you were, the more you paid, which is theoretically fair taxation, except John kept raising the percentages until people couldn't afford to inherit their own property. Want justice in a legal dispute? You had to offer the king money to hear your case, with the understanding that whoever paid more would probably win, essentially turning the judicial system into an auction where justice went to the highest bidder, like eBay, but for court verdicts and your opponent can see your bids. The amounts John demanded were often impossibly high, seemingly designed to ensure people would fail to pay so he could seize their lands and assets as penalty, like a loan shark who structures loans so borrowers can't possibly repay and then takes their houses when they default. William de Bruce, one of John's formerly loyal barons, was demanded to pay 40,000 marks, which was an absolutely astronomical sum equivalent to several years of royal revenue, essentially billing someone for more money than existed in the entire kingdom just because John suspected disloyalty. When de Bruce couldn't pay this impossible debt, John hunted him down, seized his lands, and allegedly starved his wife and son to death, proving that John's financial system wasn't really about collecting money, but about maintaining control through terror and arbitrary power. The excessive fines served multiple purposes. They extracted wealth, they demonstrated royal power, they punished perceived disloyalty, and they created a system where everyone technically owed the king money, making everyone potentially subject to immediate punishment whenever John felt like enforcing the debt. Like living with someone who keeps track of every tiny favor and then demands repayment at the worst possible moments. John's Jewish subjects faced particularly brutal financial extraction, being legally defined as royal property who existed solely to enrich the crown, which is exactly as dehumanizing and terrible as it sounds, like people being treated as farm animals who occasionally produce money instead of milk. Medieval Christian theology prohibited charging interest on loans, but Jewish communities were forced into money-lending roles and then heavily taxed on their earnings, creating a system where they were essential to the economy but hated for their role, like being forced to be the bad guy in someone else's story and then punished for playing the part assigned to you. John extracted enormous sums from Jewish communities through talliage, special taxes that could be imposed arbitrarily without limit, making them completely vulnerable to royal greed with no legal protection or appeal process. The 1210 tallage demanded 66,000 marks from the entire Jewish population of England, with individual assessments so high that many people faced complete financial ruin, and those who couldn't pay faced imprisonment, torture, or worse, demonstrating that John's cruelty was directly proportional to his greed and that he viewed human beings as nothing more than potential revenue sources. His treatment of the church's wealth followed similar patterns of extraction disguised as politics, as John's conflict with the Pope provided the perfect excuse to seize ecclesiastical property while claiming he was defending royal rights against papal interference, like someone robbing a bank and claiming they're making a political statement about financial institutions. During the interdict from 1208 to 1213, John confiscated the revenues of vacant bishoprics, kept church lands under royal control, and essentially treated religious institutions like personal ATMs that coincidentally had been cut off from Rome, so nobody could stop him from taking everything. He made enormous profits from the church dispute, collecting an estimated 100,000 marks over 5 years, which was more than his annual royal revenue, proving that religious principle was really just a bonus excuse to steal money from institutions that couldn't effectively fight back. When John finally reconciled with the Pope in 1213, he had a promise to repay the money he'd taken. But like most of John's promises, this one was honored mostly in the breach, as he paid back some token amounts while keeping the bulk of his ill-gotten gains, like someone who steals from the company cash register and then offers to return $20 as if that settles the matter. His obsession with money transformed English government in ways that outlasted his reign, creating administrative systems and bureaucratic structures that were genuinely innovative even though John used them for oppression rather than good governance, like inventing a powerful tool and using it exclusively to hit people. The expansion of written records meant the government could track exactly who owed what, when they owed it, and how much they'd already paid, essentially creating medieval Excel spreadsheets for tracking debts and payments with accuracy that made it impossible for people to hide their wealth from royal tax collectors. This bureaucratic efficiency was actually quite advanced for the early 13th century, demonstrating organizational sophistication that would have been impressive if used for public benefit rather than personal enrichment, like admiring someone's detailed planning while recognizing they're planning a heist. The Exchequer, the royal financial department, became increasingly sophisticated under John's reign, developing procedures and protocols that would influence English government for centuries, proving that even terrible kings can accidentally contribute to administrative progress when they're obsessively focused on taking everyone's money. John's spending habits matched his extraction methods in their excessiveness, as he collected money faster than water through a fire hose and spent it just as quickly on military failures, personal luxuries, and attempts to buy loyalty that never worked because you can't purchase genuine loyalty from people you've been oppressing. His household expenses were enormous, including lavish feasts, expensive clothing, jewelry, and all the trappings of royal magnificence that were supposed to demonstrate power but really just demonstrated wastefulness. Like someone buying a sports car, they can't afford to impress people who don't care. He gave enormous gifts to foreign allies and potential supporters, trying to build coalitions through bribery, which worked temporarily until the money ran out and everyone remembered they actually hated him, like buying friendship that evaporates the moment you stop paying for drinks. The military campaigns consumed vast sums with nothing to show for it, as John spent fortunes hiring mercenaries, building siege equipment, and supplying armies that achieved nothing except proving that throwing money at problems doesn't solve them if you're also terrible at strategy and leadership. His mercenary forces deserve special mention because John relied heavily on hired soldiers rather than feudal levies, which made military sense, but was politically disastrous since mercenaries fight for pay rather than loyalty, and English barons hated that foreign soldiers were being used against them. John's most famous mercenary captain was Fawkes de Brut, whose name sounds like a villain from a fantasy novel, and whose behavior lived up to that expectation, as he and his men committed atrocities throughout England in John's service, burning, looting, and terrorizing the population like a medieval protection racket with royal authorization. Using mercenaries allowed John to field forces when his barons refused to fight for him, which was increasingly often because nobody wanted to die for a king they hated in wars they opposed. But it also meant he was paying premium prices for soldiers who had no stake in England's future and no reason to care about anything except their wages. The mercenaries were effective in combat, but terrible for public relations, as nothing says, "I've lost the support of my own people," quite like hiring foreigners to fight your domestic enemies, like a CEO bringing in outside security to intimidate the workers during a strike. The cost of maintaining royal castles and fortifications was another massive expense, as John inherited a kingdom full of expensive stone castles that required constant maintenance, garrison pay, and supplies, like owning hundreds of houses that all need repairs simultaneously while you're also broke. He invested in improving defenses at strategic locations, which was actually smart policy, except it meant spending money on walls and towers while his subjects starved and rebelled, creating fortresses that would eventually be used against him by rebel barons who captured them. Some estimates suggest John spent over £50,000 on castle building and maintenance during his reign, which was an enormous sum equivalent to multiple years of revenue, like someone spending their entire salary on home security systems because they're paranoid everyone wants to rob them, which becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy when they can't afford anything else and people actually do start robbing them. The irony is that John's investment in fortifications didn't save him because the real threat wasn't foreign invasion but domestic rebellion, and you can't build walls high enough to protect yourself from your own subjects when literally everyone hates you. His financial desperation in the final years reached truly absurd levels, as John demanded money from everyone for everything, acting like a king who knew his time was running out and wanted to grab as much as possible before the inevitable collapse, like someone maxing out all their credit cards because bankruptcy is imminent anyway. The taxes and fines demanded to fund the Bovines campaign were crushing, and when that campaign failed spectacularly, John had the audacity to demand more money to continue the war, which is like a contractor who builds your house wrong and then charges you double to fix their mistakes. The barons refused, leading directly to the rebellion and Magna Carta, proving that even medieval people had a limit to how much abuse they'd accept before saying enough was enough and organizing collective action against tyranny. The financial clauses in Magna Carta specifically limited John's ability to impose arbitrary fines and taxes without consent, essentially putting his allowance under supervision like a teenager who can't be trusted with a credit card. And these provisions would eventually evolve into the principle that taxation requires representation, making John's greed an accidental foundation for democratic financial systems. His treasure train lost in the wash allegedly contained not just gold and silver, but also the crown jewels, important documents, and other irreplaceable royal regalia, meaning John literally lost the symbols of his kingship in the mud, which is such a perfect metaphor for his entire reign that it barely requires commentary. Some historians question whether the treasure was really lost, or if John was simply broke by that point, and the lost treasure was an excuse for why he couldn't pay his debts, which would be very on-brand for John, like someone claiming their homework was eaten by a dog when they never did the homework in the first place. Either way, the incident symbolizes how John's obsession with accumulating wealth ultimately left him with nothing, proving that greed doesn't lead to lasting wealth, but to spectacular losses, and that maybe treating your kingdom like a piggy bank you can smash whenever you need money isn't a sustainable economic policy. The fact that John's treasure supposedly disappeared into a tidal estuary while he was fleeing from enemies in his own kingdom, dying of disease, and watching his life's work collapse around him is such poetic justice that if it appeared in fiction, people would complain it was too heavy-handed. John's relationship with the church beyond the interdict crisis reveals a man who understood religion primarily as a political tool and a source of revenue, rather than as actual faith, like someone who joins a country club, not because they enjoy golf, but because they want to network with wealthy members. He was reportedly pious in his own way, hearing Mass regularly and supporting various religious houses. But this devotion seems selective and transactional, as if he believed God could be bribed with donations the same way he tried to bribe earthly supporters with gifts and promises. His religious foundations and grants to monasteries were often motivated by political considerations rather than genuine spirituality, like a corrupt politician photographed at church on Sunday before returning to embezzlement on Monday, using religion as a prop rather than a guide for ethical behavior. Medieval chroniclers, most of whom were churchmen, portrayed John as impious and possibly even blasphemous, claiming he made jokes during Mass and showed disrespect for religious ceremonies. Though these accounts might be exaggerated by writers who hated him for seizing church property and generally making their lives miserable during the interdict years. His appointments to church positions when he had the opportunity demonstrated that John valued loyalty and administrative ability over religious devotion, which makes sense from a practical governing perspective, but reveals his fundamentally cynical view of ecclesiastical offices as just another part of his patronage system. He wanted bishops who would support royal interests rather than papal interests, which is reasonable enough, except John's interests were usually terrible, and supporting them meant enabling tyranny and oppression, like hiring executives who will help you commit fraud rather than executives who will run a legitimate business. The conflict with Pope Innocent III over Stephen Langton's appointment was partly about this principle. John wanted to control church appointments in England, while the Pope insisted on his right to appoint bishops without royal interference, which is a legitimate constitutional question about the relationship between church and state, except John handled it with his usual diplomatic grace, meaning he immediately escalated to seizing all church property and threatening violence like a negotiator, whose only tactic is hostage-taking. Stephen Langton himself turned out to be one of John's most significant enemies, which is ironic considering John fought so hard against his appointment, like desperately trying to prevent someone from becoming your boss, and then discovering they're exactly as terrible as you feared, but for completely different reasons than you expected. Langton was actually a brilliant theologian and administrator who would play a crucial role in drafting Magna Carta, essentially becoming the constitutional architect who transformed baronial grievances into legal principles that would outlast everyone involved. John probably thought accepting Langton was a defeat, and he was right, but not because Langton was a papal puppet as John feared. Instead, Langton had principles and believed kings should follow the law, which made him fundamentally incompatible with John's vision of kingship as absolute power limited only by the king's own whims and paranoia. The archbishop provided intellectual and moral legitimacy to the baronial rebellion, giving the movement against John a religious dimension that made it harder to dismiss as mere aristocratic greed, like a workers' strike that gains credibility when religious leaders join the picket lines. John's submission to the Pope in 1213, making England a papal fief, was supposed to protect him from enemies by putting him under the Pope's protection, which is the medieval equivalent of calling the mob for protection from other criminals, except the mob is the Catholic Church and the other criminals are your own nobles who hate you. The deal required John to pay annual tribute to Rome, essentially becoming the Pope's tenant king, which must have been humiliating for someone who'd spent years defying papal authority and claiming to defend royal independence from church interference. Innocent III did provide support after John's submission, declaring Magna Carta void and excommunicating the rebel barons. But this papal backing came too late to save John's reputation or his kingdom, like getting a reference letter after you've already been fired and everyone knows why. The arrangement did benefit Henry III after John's death, as papal support helped the Regency government defeat the rebels and establish the young king's authority, proving that John's one strategic success was accidentally beneficial to someone else rather than himself, which perfectly summarizes his entire political career. His interactions with the clergy during the interdict years ranged from threatening to cruel, as John apparently didn't understand that you can't win a religious argument with violence and intimidation, or perhaps he understood but didn't care because violence and intimidation were his default responses to any opposition. He expelled monks from monasteries, imprisoned clergy who resisted his orders, and allegedly threatened to mutilate and kill priests who left England to join the Pope's side, like a manager who responds to employee complaints by making increasingly unhinged threats until nobody wants to work there anymore. Some bishops fled to the continent rather than face John's wrath, choosing exile over collaboration with a king they considered tyrannical and possibly heretical, which is the medieval equivalent of senior executives resigning in protest when they realize the CEO is driving the company into criminal territory. The interdict meant ordinary people suffered without access to sacraments and religious services, creating widespread resentment that John seemed to think was the Pope's fault rather than his own, like someone who starts a fight and then complains that the other person won't stop fighting back. John's understanding of excommunication seemed limited to its political implications rather than its spiritual meaning, treating his exclusion from the church like a legal technicality rather than eternal damnation, which suggests either he didn't really believe in Christian theology or he believed God would make exceptions for kings who were really sorry at the end. Being excommunicated meant John's soul was in mortal danger according to medieval theology, and his subjects were theoretically released from their oaths of loyalty, which is extremely serious in a society where religion wasn't optional and where everyone genuinely believed in heaven, hell, and eternal judgment. John's response to excommunication was essentially, "So what?" And he continued governing as if nothing had changed, possibly the only time in his life he showed genuine courage, except it was courage in service of stubbornness rather than any noble principle, like someone who refuses to evacuate during a hurricane because they don't want to admit they were wrong about the weather forecast. His willingness to remain excommunicated for years suggests either remarkable faith that he could fix things eventually or remarkable lack of faith that excommunication mattered, and knowing John's character, the latter seems more likely. The reconciliation with the church required John to compensate clergy for their losses during the interdict, promise to restore church properties and rights, and generally acknowledge that his entire policy had been wrong, which must have been psychologically devastating for someone who hated admitting mistakes more than he hated losing money. The compensation payments were supposed to total 100,000 marks, though John never paid the full amount, because of course he didn't. Treating even this solemn religious obligation like a negotiable debt he could partial payment his way out of, like promising to pay back a loan and then sending occasional checks for random amounts while claiming financial hardship. The clergy never received full restitution, adding another group to the long list of people John owed money to, and another example of his promises being essentially worthless, like a check that bounces but somehow remains legally valid because the bank is terrified of the account holder. The failure to fully compensate the church meant that even after reconciliation, many clergy remained hostile to John, providing moral support to the baronial rebellion and generally making clear they preferred a different king, perhaps one who paid his debts and didn't spend years seizing their property. John's religious legacy is basically non-existent except as a cautionary tale about using the church for political purposes without understanding or respecting its spiritual significance, like someone who treats a cathedral as a networking venue and then wonders why everyone there seems upset about something. He founded a few monasteries and made some grants to religious houses, but nothing that suggests genuine piety or concern for his soul's salvation. More like charity as public relations or insurance policy, the medieval equivalent of a corporation's diversity initiative that exists primarily for tax purposes and positive press. Unlike many medieval kings who were remembered for their religious foundations, pilgrimages, or support for the church, John is remembered for fighting the church, losing that fight, surrendering his kingdom to the Pope, and generally demonstrating that religious conflicts are unwinnable when you're in the wrong and everyone knows it. His conflict with Innocent III demonstrates that even absolute political power has limits when facing an institution with moral authority and international reach, a lesson that remains relevant centuries later, even if the specific institutional structures have changed dramatically. The irony that John's submission to the papacy helped preserve the Angevin monarchy for his son, while his defiance of his own nobles led to constitutional limitations on royal power, is too perfect to be accidental, suggesting that John's political instincts were exactly backward, and he succeeded only when forced to do the opposite of what he wanted. If he'd worked with his barons and resisted the Pope more effectively, perhaps England would have developed differently, with a stronger monarchy and weaker parliament, making John accidentally responsible for English constitutional development by being such a terrible king that people invented new systems of government specifically to prevent anyone like him from having unlimited power again. His religious policy, like his financial policy and military policy, and basically all his policies, was characterized by short-term thinking, personal vindictiveness, and an inability to understand that governance requires building coalitions and maintaining support rather than just taking what you want and threatening anyone who complains. The fact that the Pope declared Magna Carta invalid, but the document survived and thrived while John died, and was quickly forgotten, suggests that moral authority ultimately matters more than military power, and that documents expressing principles outlast individuals who oppose those principles through force. John's personal religious beliefs remain mysterious, as medieval chroniclers focused more on his actions than his internal spiritual life. But his behavior suggests someone who went through religious motions without genuine conviction, like someone who attends church because it's expected but spends the service thinking about lunch. Whether he feared hell or believed in divine judgment remains unclear, though his deathbed reportedly included confession and receiving last rites, suggesting that when faced with actual death, he took religion seriously, or at least hedged his bets in case the priests were right about eternal consequences. His burial at Worcester Cathedral rather than a royal mausoleum suggests some spiritual concern, as Worcester contained the tomb of St. Wulfstan, and John reportedly requested burial. They're hoping the saint's proximity would help his soul, like choosing to be buried next to someone famous, hoping their reputation rubs off in the afterlife. Whether this represents genuine piety or just final desperation from a man who'd spent his life making enemies and wanted any possible help in the next world remains debatable. But it's fitting that John's last act involved trying to manipulate religious institutions for personal benefit, remaining consistent with his character right up until the end. His relationship with religion ultimately reveals a man who understood faith primarily as a social and political force rather than a personal relationship with the divine, treating God like another baron who could be negotiated with, bribed, or, if necessary, defied, which is possibly the most John thing possible. He seemed to believe that religious obligations could be fulfilled through transactional exchanges, donations in return for prayers, foundations in exchange for salvation, without understanding that spirituality requires genuine transformation rather than just checking boxes on a divine to-do list. This transactional view of religion matched his transactional view of everything else. Loyalty could be bought, justice could be sold, and even God's favor could be negotiated through the right combination of payments and promises, revealing a fundamentally cynical worldview where everything had a price and nothing had intrinsic value beyond its usefulness to John's interests. The fact that this worldview led to complete disaster suggests that maybe some things can't be reduced to transactions, that trust and loyalty and faith require more than payments and threats, and that a kingdom built entirely on fear and greed will eventually collapse when people decide they've had enough, regardless of how many castles you've built or how much money you've extracted from your suffering subjects. John's personality quirks and daily habits reveal a man who was paranoid to the point of dysfunction, suspicious of everyone including his closest advisors, and apparently incapable of relaxing or trusting anyone even when basic logic suggested that constant vigilance was exhausting and counterproductive. He reportedly changed his sleeping locations frequently, never staying in the same chamber for more than a few nights, moving through his various castles like a hunted animal trying to avoid predators, except the predators were mostly imaginary and the real danger came from his own policies, making everyone hate him. This level of security consciousness would be reasonable for a king with genuine assassination threats, and John definitely had those. But his paranoia exceeded any realistic danger and became a self-reinforcing cycle where his suspicious behavior made people distrust him, which justified more suspicious behavior in an endless spiral of dysfunction. His sleeping arrangements must have been nightmarish for his servants, who had to constantly prepare different rooms, move belongings, and adapt to John's unpredictable schedule, like working for a boss who randomly relocates the office every few days because he thinks someone might have bugged the conference room. His eating habits combined gluttony with paranoia in ways that made mealtimes both extravagant and tense, as John apparently loved food, but also feared poisoning, creating dinner parties where the king enjoyed multiple courses while also subjecting everything to elaborate testing procedures that made everyone uncomfortable. Contemporary accounts describe him as an enthusiastic eater who particularly enjoyed fine wines and exotic dishes, spending lavishly on imported spices, expensive meats, and delicacies that most of his subjects couldn't imagine tasting. Like a food influencer who posts pictures of expensive meals while their followers struggle to afford groceries. His wine consumption was apparently substantial even by medieval standards, where drinking alcohol with every meal was normal because water was often unsafe, suggesting John was either an alcoholic or just really committed to staying hydrated through fermented grapes. The food tasting rituals meant that servants had to sample everything before John would eat it, essentially using human beings as poison detectors, which is both cruel and ineffective since tasters could be bribed and poison could be slow-acting, proving that paranoia doesn't necessarily lead to actual security, just to elaborate theater that makes everyone nervous. John's temper was legendary and apparently unpredictable, exploding over minor issues while sometimes remaining calm during actual crises, like a boss who screams about coffee temperatures but stays quiet during budget meetings, making it impossible for anyone to predict what would set him off. Chronicles record incidents where John became so angry he allegedly threw himself on the floor, gnawed sticks and straw in rage, and generally behaved like a toddler having a meltdown, which is not behavior that inspires confidence in one's leadership abilities or suggests emotional stability. His rages sometimes led to violence against servants or courtiers, with John reportedly striking people who displeased him, which created an atmosphere of constant fear where everyone walked on eggshells trying not to trigger another outburst. This volatility made governance nearly impossible because nobody wanted to deliver bad news to a king who might respond with irrational fury, leading to a situation where John was surrounded by yes-men and flatterers who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know, like a CEO whose employees have learned that honest feedback results in being fired or worse. His relationships with women beyond his marriages reveal a pattern of using power to take what he wanted without regard for consent or consequences, which medieval chroniclers described euphemistically, but which clearly means sexual assault and abuse of authority in ways that were condemned even by 13th century standards. The accusations that John seduced or forced himself on noblemen's wives and daughters appear in multiple sources, suggesting either the claims were true or at least widely believed, and either way indicate that John's reputation included being a sexual predator who couldn't be trusted around women, which is both morally reprehensible and politically catastrophic. Medieval aristocratic culture tolerated a lot of male behavior that we'd find unacceptable, but there were lines even then, and using royal power to sexually assault noblemen's female relatives apparently crossed those lines, turning personal enemies into mortal enemies who would eventually rebel. The fact that these accusations appear specifically as reasons for baronial rebellion suggests that John's behavior wasn't just private misconduct, but public outrage that united his enemies, like a politician whose scandals become the rallying point for opposition parties to finally work together. John's intelligence was apparently considerable, which makes his failures even more frustrating because he clearly understood problems but made terrible decisions anyway, like someone who aces the written driving test but then crashes the car during the practical exam because they panic under pressure. He was literate in Latin and French, interested in administrative details, and capable of sophisticated legal and political reasoning when he bothered to apply himself thoughtfully rather than just reacting emotionally. Contemporary chronicles acknowledge his cleverness while condemning his character, suggesting John was smart enough to know better but chose to act badly anyway, which is somehow worse than being stupid and well-meaning, like a doctor who knows exactly how to help patients but deliberately prescribes the wrong medication for personal profit. His administrative innovations demonstrate genuine intelligence applied to governance, but that intelligence was directed toward oppression rather than justice, toward extraction rather than prosperity, proving once again that being smart doesn't make you good and that intelligence without ethics is just sophisticated evil. His sense of humor was reportedly crude and often cruel, involving mocking people who couldn't fight back or making jokes at others' expense, like a schoolyard bully who thinks he's hilarious, but everyone else just finds him mean and pathetic. Some sources claim John made blasphemous jokes during religious services, which might be exaggerated by hostile chroniclers, but suggests at minimum that he didn't take religion as seriously as medieval society expected, treating sacred ceremonies with a reverence that offended pious observers. His court was apparently less refined than his father's or brother's, with John preferring company that matched his own crude tastes rather than maintaining the dignified atmosphere expected of royal courts. Like a CEO who turns executive meetings into fraternity parties and wonders why investors lose confidence. The lowbrow character of John's court added to his reputation as an unworthy king who didn't understand or respect the dignity his position required, failing at the performative aspects of kingship that mattered enormously in medieval political culture, where symbolism and ceremony were fundamental to legitimate authority. John's work ethic was actually quite strong, which might surprise people who think of him as a lazy tyrant. But he was actively involved in administration, legal proceedings, and the daily business of government in ways that demonstrated real engagement with governance, even if his policies were terrible. He traveled constantly throughout England, personally presiding over legal cases, checking on his castles and officials, and generally doing the actual work of medieval kingship rather than delegating everything to ministers like some monarchs did. This hands-on approach meant John had detailed knowledge of his kingdom and its administration, which he used primarily to identify opportunities for extraction and oppression. Like a manager who monitors employees closely not to help them succeed, but to catch them in mistakes that justify punishment. His administrative paperwork was extensive, producing more government records than previous reigns, suggesting John was organized, detail-oriented, and committed to bureaucratic thoroughness, even while using that bureaucracy for tyrannical purposes, proving that efficiency isn't inherently good if it's efficiently accomplishing evil goals. His literacy and education meant John could actually read the documents he was signing rather than relying entirely on advisors, which sounds like an advantage, but apparently just gave him more direct involvement in oppressing his subjects without the filter of ministers who might have moderated his worst impulses. He reportedly enjoyed reading and owned books, which was unusual for medieval kings who were often barely literate despite their education, suggesting genuine intellectual curiosity or at least appreciation for learning, though what he read and what lessons he took from it remain unclear. His interest in law and legal procedures would have been valuable if applied to creating justice rather than manipulating legal systems for personal advantage. Like a lawyer who understands the law perfectly, but uses that understanding to exploit loopholes and abuse the system rather than to ensure fair outcomes. John's intelligence, combined with his terrible character, created someone who was competently evil rather than incompetently evil, achieving his oppressive goals efficiently rather than stumbling into them accidentally, which is arguably worse because it suggests deliberate choice rather than unfortunate mistakes. His personal appearance is poorly documented compared to his actions, with few detailed contemporary descriptions of what John actually looked like beyond the generic "he was of medium height" that medieval chroniclers used when they didn't want to say someone was short. Later artistic representations show him as stern or cruel-looking, but these were created long after his death by people who knew his reputation and probably made him look villainous deliberately, like casting an actor with a sinister face to play a character the audience is supposed to hate. The effigy on his tomb at Worcester shows an idealized king, handsome and peaceful, which is standard for royal tombs, and tells us nothing about what John actually looked like while alive and terrorizing his subjects. We know he was the youngest son, that he apparently lacked Richard's imposing physical presence and military charisma, and that his nickname, Lackland, came from his inheritance situation rather than any physical characteristic. But beyond these basics, his actual appearance remains mysterious, which is somehow fitting for a king who was paranoid about his image and reputation, but left almost no reliable information about his personal characteristics. His legacy within his own family was toxic, as Henry III grew up knowing his father had been so hated that the kingdom erupted in civil war. French invaders nearly conquered England, and the barons forced constitutional limitations on royal power that would shape English governance forever. Henry spent much of his reign trying to restore royal authority while working within Magna Carta's constraints, essentially cleaning up John's mess while pretending his father hadn't been a complete disaster, like a son taking over the family business after his father ran into bankruptcy and legal troubles. The fact that Henry III reigned for 56 years and generally managed to avoid his father's mistakes suggests that watching John's failures was actually educational, teaching by negative example exactly what not to do as king, like learning fire safety by watching someone else's house burn down because they ignored basic precautions. John's grandchildren and more distant descendants would include some of England's greatest kings, suggesting that the family line eventually recovered from John's catastrophic reign, proving that one terrible generation doesn't doom an entire dynasty if subsequent generations learn from those mistakes and deliberately choose different paths. His household staff and personal servants probably hated their jobs, working for an unpredictable, paranoid boss who changed locations constantly, erupted in random rages, suspected everyone of treachery, and generally made employment a miserable experience despite the prestige of royal service. The constant travel meant packing and unpacking endlessly. The paranoia meant constant surveillance and suspicion, and the violence meant real danger of physical harm if John decided you were a threat or just annoyed him on a bad day. Like working for an abusive boss who might fire you or assault you, depending on his mood. Servants who worked for previous kings probably compared John unfavorably to his predecessors, gossiping about how much worse conditions had become under the new regime, spreading negative stories throughout England, as only domestic staff can when they witness private behavior that contradicts public image. The fact that we have these detailed accounts of John's personal quirks and private behavior suggests his servants talked extensively about their terrible employer, creating the historical record of his dysfunction through a combination of official chronicles and private gossip that spread throughout medieval society, like workplace complaints spreading through social media today. John's impact on English law extended far beyond Magna Carta, as his reign demonstrated exactly what could go wrong when a king viewed the legal system as a personal profit center rather than a mechanism for justice, essentially running medieval England like a protection racket disguised as governance. The concept of justice delayed is justice denied was personified by John, who regularly made people wait years for legal proceedings while extracting payments at every stage, turning the judicial system into an obstacle course where only the wealthy could afford to reach the finish line. His practice of selling justice to the highest bidder wasn't entirely new, as previous kings had charged for access to royal courts. But John systematized and expanded this practice to absurd levels, essentially putting price tags on every possible legal action, from filing complaints to enforcing judgments. The perversion of justice under John became so notorious that Magna Carta's most famous clause, "To no one will we sell, to no one will we deny or delay, right or justice," was specifically addressing his behavior, like a company policy written explicitly because one employee kept doing something so terrible they had to make it officially forbidden. His manipulation of inheritance laws showed particular creativity in finding ways to extract money from bereaved families, charging fees that varied based on how much he thought people could pay rather than any consistent legal principle, like a funeral home that charges different prices depending on how sad the family looks. When nobles died, their heirs had to pay relief to inherit their lands, and John set these fees arbitrarily high, sometimes demanding multiple years' worth of estate income as payment for the privilege of receiving property that legally belonged to them anyway. He held inheritances hostage, refusing to grant possession until payment was made, essentially extorting families during their grief, which is both morally bankrupt and strategically stupid because it guaranteed that every noble family would eventually have personal reasons to hate him. The system meant that sons couldn't inherit their fathers' lands without impoverishing themselves, creating a generation of nobles who started their tenures deeply in debt to the crown, like requiring new employees to take out massive loans as a condition of employment, and then wondering why they're resentful and unproductive. His treatment of widows was particularly callous, as John viewed aristocratic widows as assets to be sold to the highest bidder or used as rewards for loyal supporters, treating women as property rather than individuals with rights to their own inheritance or choice in remarriage. Widows had to pay huge sums to avoid being married off to men they didn't choose, essentially buying their own freedom from forced remarriage, which is the medieval equivalent of charging someone to not be trafficked. Some widows paid enormous fines for the right to remain unmarried or to choose their own husbands, turning personal autonomy into a commodity that only the wealthy could afford, like a subscription service for basic human dignity. The practice of selling wardship and marriage rights meant John controlled the marriages of heirs and heiresses, arranging unions based on who paid the most rather than any consideration of personal compatibility or family honor, treating aristocratic children like commodities at auction. This commodification of marriage and inheritance created deep resentment among the nobility, who watched their families' futures being sold to strangers, their children's marriages arranged for royal profit, and their widows extorted, all in the name of royal prerogative that John interpreted as license to do whatever enriched him personally. His use of hostages transformed what should have been an exceptional security measure into routine policy, holding children and wives of nobles as permanent insurance against rebellion, creating a kingdom where the ruling class lived in constant fear that their loved ones would be harmed if John suspected disloyalty. The hostage system was medieval human shields combined with a protection racket, where nobles paid taxes and fines while also surrendering family members to guarantee their cooperation, like a government that requires citizens to leave their children as collateral for paying taxes. Some hostages were well treated and lived comfortably in royal custody, but the threat of harm was always present, and John's reputation for cruelty meant everyone knew he was capable of following through if angered. The psychological impact of having your children or wife held hostage must have been devastating, creating constant anxiety and resentment that poisoned any possible loyalty to the crown, turning what should have been relationships between lord and vassal into relationships between captor and prisoner. John's forest laws were another source of oppression, as he expanded the royal forests where only the king could hunt, encompassing vast territories where local people couldn't cut wood, hunt game, or use resources on their own lands without permission and payment. The forest laws were notoriously harsh, with punishment for poaching that could include mutilation, blinding, or death, essentially making survival a crime if you lived near royal forest and needed food or firewood. John expanded the boundaries of royal forest aggressively, bringing more land under his control and creating more opportunities to fine people for violations, like a homeowners association that keeps expanding the list of rules and increasing fines for infractions until everyone in the neighborhood is constantly in violation. The administration of forest law was corrupt and arbitrary, with officials accepting bribes to overlook violations while severely punishing those who couldn't pay, creating a two-tiered system where the wealthy could effectively buy permission to break rules while the poor faced brutal enforcement. Magna Carta included numerous clauses addressing forest law abuses, demanding that John disforest areas he'd illegally claimed and reform the administration of forest justice, suggesting that this was among the most hated aspects of his reign, alongside the financial extortion and arbitrary imprisonment. His perversion of legal customs meant that traditional rights and protections became meaningless when John decided to ignore them, demonstrating that unwritten constitutional principles only work if the king chooses to respect them. Otherwise, they're just suggestions that powerful people can disregard at will. English common law was developing during John's reign, building on precedents and customs that theoretically limited royal power. But John treated these limitations as obstacles to be circumvented rather than rules to be followed, like a driver who knows the speed limit but considers it merely advisory. His willingness to arrest people without charge, seize property without legal process, and generally ignore any inconvenient laws demonstrated that medieval England needed written constitutional protections because traditional customs weren't enough to restrain a determined tyrant. The barons who forced John to accept Magna Carta understood this lesson clearly. They demanded written guarantees because John had proven that verbal promises and traditional practices meant nothing if the king decided to violate them. Like employees who demand written contracts after watching their boss repeatedly ignore verbal agreements and company policies. The specific legal abuses listed in Magna Carta read like a criminal indictment of John's entire judicial system, with clause after clause addressing practices that John had normalized during his reign, turning the document into essentially a list of everything the king had been doing wrong. Clauses prohibiting arbitrary arrest and imprisonment were direct responses to John's practice of locking up nobles on suspicion alone, without charges or trials, using royal dungeons as threats to ensure compliance. Provisions about proportional fines addressed John's habit of imposing crushing financial penalties that bore no relationship to the offense, essentially fining people into poverty as punishment for minor violations or as extraction disguised as justice. Requirements for due process and fair trials responded to John's manipulation of judicial proceedings to favor whoever paid him more, selling verdicts like merchandise rather than dispensing impartial justice. The document's emphasis on protecting baronial rights from royal interference reflects how thoroughly John had trampled on those rights, creating a constitutional crisis that required explicit written limitations on royal power, because the king had demonstrated he couldn't be trusted to exercise power responsibly. John's legal legacy is therefore paradoxical. He was such a terrible king who abused legal systems so thoroughly that he accidentally created the conditions for constitutional development that would limit royal power and establish principles of justice that survive 8 centuries later. Magna Carta wouldn't exist without John's abuses providing the necessity for its creation, like how safety regulations are often written in response to catastrophic accidents that reveal dangerous practices. The specific clauses addressing John's behavior became foundations for broader legal principles. The prohibition on arbitrary arrest evolved into habeas corpus protections. The requirement for proportional punishment influenced sentencing guidelines, and the general principle that even kings must follow law became bedrock of constitutional monarchy. Modern legal systems owe John a debt not because he created anything good, but because he was so comprehensively bad that people invented constitutional protections specifically to prevent anyone like him from having unchecked power again, making him accidentally influential through negative example rather than positive contribution. His contemporaries who drafted Magna Carta probably didn't realize they were creating one of history's most important legal documents. They just wanted to stop John from robbing and oppressing them, using written guarantees because verbal promises from John were worthless. The Charter's survival and evolution beyond John's reign transformed it from a temporary truce document into a constitutional foundation. But that transformation happened because later generations recognized the principle's value, not because John or the original barons intended to create lasting constitutional law. The fact that Magna Carta's most important legacy came decades and centuries after its initial drafting suggests that great legal principles sometimes emerge accidentally from specific conflicts, taking on broader meaning as circumstances change and new generations reinterpret foundational texts. John's contribution was being the crisis that necessitated the solution, the disease that made people develop the cure, the terrible example that showed everyone exactly what needed to be prevented in future. His judicial corruption extended to his sheriffs and local officials, who understood that John valued revenue generation over justice and administered their regions accordingly, essentially running medieval England like a criminal enterprise with official government sanction. Sheriffs collected taxes, administered justice, and enforced royal authority in their counties. But under John's reign, they operated more like mafia enforcers, collecting protection money and settling disputes based on who paid the most. The system was self-reinforcing. Sheriffs who collected the most revenue received rewards and continued employment, while those who prioritized justice over extraction risked losing their positions, creating incentives that guaranteed corruption throughout the administrative hierarchy. John personally monitored sheriff performance, reviewing accounts, and demanding explanations for shortfalls, essentially running medieval England like a franchise operation where regional managers competed to maximize profits regardless of methods or ethics. The result was a kingdom where local justice was as corrupt as royal justice, where ordinary people faced oppression at every level of government, and where the entire system existed primarily to enrich those in power rather than to serve the common good. His destruction of traditional checks on royal power meant that England under John became effectively an autocracy limited only by the king's personal capacity to project force, which given John's paranoia and incompetence was actually fairly limited, but still terrible for everyone subject to his authority. Medieval English kingship traditionally involved consultation with nobles, respect for customary laws, and at least nominal adherence to principles of just governance. But John treated these traditions as obstacles rather than guidelines, governing as if king meant dictator who owns everything and everyone. His reign proved that constitutional customs without enforcement mechanisms are meaningless against a determined autocrat, teaching a lesson that would influence English and later American constitutional development. Rights must be protected by law and institutions, not just by tradition and good faith, because tyrants will always claim emergencies or necessities that justify ignoring inconvenient limitations on their power. John's legacy in legal history is therefore as the bad example that proved why constitutional protections matter, why rule of law must apply even to rulers, and why governance requires institutional checks on executive power rather than depending on rulers' personal virtue or restraint. Lessons that remain relevant 8 centuries later, even though modern democracies operate under completely different systems than medieval feudal monarchy. John's comparison with his brothers reveals a family where each son inherited different aspects of their parents' abilities and personalities, like a genetic lottery where Richard got the military prowess and charisma, while John got the paranoia and administrative obsession without the competence to use them effectively. Richard the Lionheart has gone down in history as a warrior king and crusader hero, despite spending maybe 6 months actually in England during his 10-year reign and bankrupting the kingdom to fund his overseas adventures, proving that medieval reputation was more about style than substance, like a celebrity who's famous for being famous rather than for any actual accomplishments. Richard spoke primarily French, had little interest in English affairs, and basically treated England as an ATM to fund his crusading and wars in France. Yet he's remembered fondly because he looked good in armor, won battles, and died dramatically during a siege, which apparently matters more than actually governing your kingdom competently. John, by contrast, actually stayed in England, tried to govern personally, and engaged with the boring administrative work of kingship. Yet he's remembered as one of history's worst kings because he was cruel, greedy, paranoid, and lost wars instead of winning them, demonstrating that perception matters more than effort and that being a spectacular failure is worse than being an absent success. Geoffrey, the brother between Richard and John, died before becoming king, but was apparently quite capable and would have been interesting to watch as monarch, except he got killed in a jousting tournament in 1186 like a medieval workplace accident, leaving behind young Arthur, whose claim to the throne created the succession crisis that John handled by probably murdering him. Geoffrey's early death meant John moved up in the succession, which is possibly the worst thing that could have happened to England, like a company where the qualified candidate dies and the position goes to the least capable person remaining on the organizational chart. Henry the Young King, the eldest brother, was crowned during his father's lifetime, but died in 1183 before inheriting actual power, possibly saving England from another problematic monarch, since he'd already rebelled against his father and shown poor judgment. The Angevin brothers as a group were charismatic, intelligent, and absolutely terrible at family relationships, rebelling against their father, fighting among themselves, and generally treating family loyalty as optional, like a dynasty of backstabbers where the only question was who'd betray whom first and for what reason. John's relationship with his mother Eleanor of Aquitaine was complicated, as she was one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, having been Queen of France and then England, and she apparently preferred Richard over John, which must have been psychologically damaging for the youngest son, who already felt overlooked. Eleanor was brilliant, politically astute, and capable of running kingdoms while her sons were fighting crusades or losing French territories, making John's failures even more embarrassing because he had an example of competent governance right in his own family and still couldn't manage it. She supported Richard during his reign and worked to secure John's succession after Richard died. Probably not because she thought John would be a great king, but because he was the only surviving adult son, and the alternative was civil war over Arthur's claim. Eleanor lived until 1204, long enough to see John lose Normandy and most of the French territories she'd brought to the Angevin dynasty through her marriages, essentially watching her life's political work collapse under her incompetent youngest son's governance, like a founder watching their successor destroy the company they've built over decades. His father, Henry II, was one of England's most capable kings, creating an administrative system and legal framework that would influence English governance for centuries, making John's failures even more striking because he inherited a well-functioning kingdom and ran it into the ground within 17 years. Henry II had established royal justice, developed common law, controlled a vast empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, and generally governed effectively despite numerous challenges, including rebellious sons and conflict with the church over Thomas Becket's murder. John inherited this system and used it primarily for oppression and extraction, like someone who inherits a successful business and immediately starts embezzling from it while alienating customers and employees. The comparison between father and son shows that institutional strength means nothing if the person running those institutions is incompetent or malicious, and that good governance requires not just effective systems, but also leaders who use those systems for public benefit rather than personal enrichment. John's nephews and nieces included numerous legitimate and illegitimate descendants of his brothers, creating a large extended family where John was paranoid about potential rivals to his throne, seeing threats in children and relatives who probably had no interest in challenging his authority until he gave them reasons to hate him. Arthur of Brittany was the most obvious threat, being Geoffrey's son with a legitimate claim to the throne, but John's probable murder of Arthur eliminated that rival, while creating a scandal that damaged his reputation permanently, proving that sometimes the cover-up is worse than the crime, or in this case, the murder created more problems than the threat it eliminated. Richard's illegitimate children posed no succession threat, but John apparently resented them anyway, like someone who's jealous of their siblings' children because they represent relationships and legacies that make the jealous person feel inadequate. The extended Angevin family was vast and complicated, with members scattered across England and France, creating a network of relationships that could have been sources of support, but under John's paranoid governance became potential threats requiring surveillance and control. His own children included 5 legitimate offspring with Isabella of Angoulême, plus numerous illegitimate children from various relationships, showing that John's issues with women didn't prevent him from having plenty of sexual relationships, even if those relationships were often non-consensual or exploitative. His son Henry became Henry III and reigned for 56 years, essentially spending his entire life dealing with the constitutional consequences of his father's tyranny, like a son who spends decades in therapy addressing issues created by a terrible parent. Richard of Cornwall, John's second son, became a wealthy and influential noble who was elected king of Germany, achieving international prominence and demonstrating that John's children weren't doomed to failure by their father's terrible example. They just had to work harder to overcome the family reputation. His daughters married into various European royal families, creating alliances and diplomatic connections, proving that even disastrous kings can have useful children who achieve things their father never managed. John's illegitimate children were numerous and scattered throughout England and Europe, products of relationships ranging from consensual affairs to likely sexual assault, representing another aspect of his terrible legacy involving women he had power over and children born into complicated situations. Medieval kings having bastards was completely normal and not particularly scandalous. But the circumstances of John's illegitimate children's conceptions often involved abuse of power that was condemned even by medieval standards where royal sexual privilege was widely accepted. Some of these illegitimate children received positions and support from John, while others were apparently ignored or forgotten, creating a tier of royal-adjacent people who had some connection to power, but no real claim to inheritance or position. The existence of numerous half-siblings to Henry III created potential succession complications. Though none of the illegitimate children seriously challenged Henry's throne, probably because everyone remembered how disastrously Arthur's challenge to John had ended and nobody wanted to repeat that experience. His comparison with other contemporary European monarchs shows that John wasn't uniquely terrible by medieval standards in terms of cruelty or ambition, but he was uniquely incompetent in achieving his goals, like someone playing the same game as everyone else, but consistently losing because they can't stop making basic mistakes. King Philip II of France, John's main rival, was cunning, patient, and effective, carefully exploiting John's weaknesses to expand French royal territory at Angevin expense. Essentially playing chess, while John played checkers, and kept accidentally throwing the pieces off the board. Philip wasn't particularly nice or ethical, but he was competent. And in medieval politics, competence mattered more than morality because effective evil could accomplish things while incompetent evil just created messes. The Holy Roman Emperor, the Pope, various German princes, Spanish kings, and other European rulers all pursued their interests with varying degrees of success. But none managed to lose as much territory or alienate their subjects as thoroughly as John, making him an outlier even in an era of ambitious and often ruthless monarchs. His place in the Angevin dynasty's decline shows how individual incompetence can destroy what took generations to build, like watching a family business that thrived under multiple generations suddenly collapse when someone incompetent takes over and makes every wrong decision possible. Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine had created a vast empire through marriage, inheritance, and military conquest, controlling territories from Scotland to the Pyrenees and creating one of medieval Europe's most powerful political entities. Richard maintained this empire through force of personality and military success, though his absences and expensive adventures strained its resources and created vulnerabilities. John inherited this magnificent political achievement and lost most of it within 5 years, then spent the rest of his reign failing to recover what he'd lost, demonstrating that legacy preservation requires competence, and that sometimes the greatest threat to a dynasty comes from within rather than from external enemies. His legacy within the Plantagenet family line continued for centuries, as his descendants ruled England until 1485, proving that one terrible king doesn't doom an entire dynasty if subsequent generations learn from his mistakes and govern more effectively. The Plantagenets produced numerous capable kings, including Edward I, Edward III, and Henry V, showing that John's failure was personal rather than genetic, and that families can recover from catastrophic leadership if given time and opportunity. However, John's reign permanently changed English monarchy by establishing that kings weren't above the law, that constitutional limitations could be enforced through written documents, and that subjects had rights that even royal authority couldn't arbitrarily violate. His failure to be the absolute monarch, he wanted to be accidentally created constitutional precedents that would eventually transform English governance from feudal monarchy toward constitutional monarchy and eventually parliamentary democracy, making John accidentally influential in the opposite way he intended. Like someone who tries to build a dictatorship but instead creates foundations for democracy by being such a terrible dictator that people invent constitutional protections to prevent anyone like him from having unlimited power again. The contrast between John's ambitions and achievements is almost comically tragic, as he apparently wanted to be remembered as a great king who restored the Angevin Empire and ruled England powerfully. But instead he's remembered as a cautionary tale about tyranny, greed, and incompetence whose greatest contribution was being so terrible that people invented constitutional limitations on royal power. His tombstone might as well read, "Here lies King John, who wanted to be great but was merely terrible, whose ambitions exceeded his abilities by such a vast margin that his failures became historically significant." Except medieval tomb inscriptions were more diplomatic, and his actual memorial portrays him as a dignified king rather than the paranoid, cruel, incompetent tyrant he actually was. The gap between John's self-image and his actual legacy suggests he probably died believing he'd been unfairly treated by ungrateful subjects and unlucky circumstances, never understanding that his problems were self-created and that competent leadership might have avoided most of his disasters. Like someone who keeps failing at everything and blames external factors rather than recognizing their own consistent contribution to their failures.